Colorado Territory. Spring of 1874, dust curled off the high plains under a sky thick with coming rain when he first saw her. Marshal Landry leaned against the porch rail of the general store in Greeley, rolling his sleeves as thunder cracked far off. His horse, tied nearby, shifted its weight, sensing the change in the air. The wind carried a strange kind of tension with it, swift, sharp, and then she stepped off the stagecoach in a torn wedding dress, boots muddy to the knees, eyes scanning the street like something was chasing her. She could not have been more than 25, pale with exhaustion, yet her face held a kind of wild grit. Her hair had once been pinned, now it curled loose around her shoulders. She clutched a satchel to her chest, but her eyes moved fast, frantic, toward the alleyways and the doors of every building. Marshall straightened. He had spent years reading people tracking outlaws, settling feuds, helping folks too broken to ask for help. And whatever she was running from, it was not over yet. She stumbled toward the sheriff's office, but the door was locked. That was no surprise. Sheriff Baines had gone south with a posse 2 days back. Marshall stepped off the porch. "Ma'am." His voice was low, steady. "You need help." She turned fast, her hand tightening on the satchel, her breath caught. "Have you seen a child, a boy, about 5 years old? Brown hair, dimple on his left cheek. His name's Daniel." Marshall's heart dropped. "No, I have not." "What happened?" She looked around again, as if she feared someone might overhear. "He was taken 3 days ago, from a wagon heading west out of Trinidad. I was supposed to marry a man I did not love, but he promised to help us. Instead, he sold Daniel off. I escaped. I have to find him." "Wait." Marshall stepped closer. "You say sold? To who?" "I do not know," she said, chest rising and falling. "He said something about a man near Fort Collins, cattle trader. That's all he said before I hit him with a skillet and ran." Marshall blinked. "You hit him with a skillet?" "I was not going to let him sell my son like a sack of potatoes." He believed her, every word. "What's your name?" "Hollis Vane. My boy and I came from Missouri. My husband died last year. We were trying to start over." Marshall nodded. "Marshall Landry." "Folks call me Marsh." She swallowed hard. "Please, I do not have money, I do not have a horse, but if you could just point me toward Fort Collins, I will do more than that," he said. "I will take you there." Her eyes widened. "Why would you help a stranger?" He shrugged one shoulder. "Because no mother should have to search for her child alone." Rain started to fall, soft at first, then hard as nails. Holly stood frozen for a moment, then her shoulders finally dropped just slightly. "Thank you," she whispered. They rode out within the hour. Marshall gave her his horse, a strong Appaloosa gelding named Hawk, and walked beside them through the storm. He could have ridden double, but she needed the strength more than he did. By nightfall, they reached a half-collapsed barn west of Platteville. The roof held mostly, and the dry straw inside was a mercy. Holly shook the rain from her hair as Marshall built a fire from what dry timber he could find. She sat close to it, hands spread toward the heat, the soaked lace of her wedding sleeves clinging to her arms. "You do not have to stay," she said without looking at him. "I know," Marshall said. He sat across from her, letting the fire warm his palms. "But I am going to." She stared into the flames. "I should have known." Something felt wrong when he said he did not want to meet Daniel until after the wedding. "But I was desperate. We were starving." "You trusted someone who promised help. That is not foolish. That is just being human." Hollis looked up at him then. Her eyes were tired, but there was something fierce behind them, something that had not given up. "You ever have children?" she asked. "No. Had a younger sister, though. Raised her after our parents died. Lost her to fever when she was 16. Quiet fell between them. The wind howled outside the barn, but inside it was only the crackle of fire and the beat of rain on the roof. "Daniel is all I have left," she said. He is sweet, loves birds, always tries to feed them crumbs even when he is hungry himself. Marshall swallowed hard. We will get him back. She nodded, but her face twisted, and she pressed her sleeve to her eyes. He did not speak. Just let her cry. When she lay down later, curled into her coat beside the fire, Marshall sat up against the wall, rifle across his knees, watching the door. He had seen enough bad men in his life to know the kind that sold children were the worst of them all. He would not let her down. The next morning, the sun cracked through the clouds. They were back on the trail before the dew dried from the grass. Marshall asked around at every ranch and trading post between Platteville and Fort Collins. A few folks remembered a man traveling with a boy who did not look like his son, too thin, too quiet, kept on a short rope like a dog. By the time they reached Fort Collins, Hollis was trembling with hope and fear in equal measure. They found the cattle trader in a clapboard house near the edge of town. His name was Boyd Cray. He denied everything at first, even laughed in Marshall's face. But when Marshall showed the badge he still wore in his coat pocket faded, but real Cray's smirk faded. "Where is the boy?" Marshall asked. "I sold him to some homesteader up near Wyoming line. Paid good for a boy to help on the land. You are going to write down his name and where he lives." "Right now." Cray hesitated, then obeyed. When Marshall turned around, Hollis was gripping the doorframe, her face pale but steady. "Are you ready?" he asked gently. She nodded. Her voice was quiet but firm. "Let us go get my son." They left Fort Collins that afternoon, heading north toward the boy, toward the unknown, and toward something neither of them could have seen coming. They crossed into the northern grasslands by dusk, where the prairie spread out in long ribbons of gold and sage, broken only by cottonwoods near slow, shallow creeks. The air smelled of damp soil and new growth, and the quiet between them wasn't heavy. It held their shared purpose like a held breath. Marshall led the way on foot, reins in hand, while Hollis rode with her coat drawn tight against the wind. She hadn't asked for rest, hadn't once slowed him down, but he could see the stiffness in her spine and the way her fingers curled on the saddle horn when they passed another homestead without stopping. By nightfall, they made camp near a cluster of boulders that broke the wind. He unsaddled Hawk, picketed him near the water, and gathered what dry grass and twigs he could find beneath a rock shelf. Hollis crouched nearby, unwrapping a heel of bread from her satchel. "You think the man Cray named is real?" Marshall struck the flint hard. He gave it up too quick to lie. "There's someone out there," she nodded, chewing slowly. "I keep wondering if Daniel's scared, or if he thinks I left him on purpose." Marshall didn't answer right away. A boy that age knows his mama's heart. "He may not understand everything, but he won't believe you gave up." She stared into the growing flames, her jaw tight. "He used to call me Bird Mama, said I'm always looking out for him like a hawk. I didn't think he noticed." Marshall folded his arms over his knees, eyes on the fire. "He noticed." They kept watch in turns. Hollis slept with her arm over her satchel, face turned toward the coals. When her breath evened out, Marshall let himself look at her just for a moment. Not because of the way she looked, but the way she carried weight without folding under it. That kind of strength didn't come from books or sermons. It came from surviving what most didn't. They reached the first of the scattered Wyoming line homesteads by midday. The wind was harder there, sweeping down from the foothills to the west, and the houses stood low and wide to keep from being torn apart. At the third place, a sod-roofed cabin with a slanting fence, a woman stepped out with a rifle across her apron. She wore a bonnet, but her face was sunburned and creased with suspicion. "We're looking for a man named Ira Pritchard," Marshall said, stopping well back from her gate. "We were told he might have taken in a boy recently." The woman narrowed her eyes. "You law?" "No," Marshall said. but I aim to help this woman find her son." The woman studied Hollis. "You the mother?" "Yes," Holly said, her voice clear despite the wind. The woman took a step forward, then lowered her rifle. "Ira's got a spread 6 miles north. Built a new sod house this spring. Keeps to himself, but I seen the boy. Small. Brown hair, doesn't speak much." "I need to go now," Holly said. Marshall thanked the woman, and they rode hard the rest of the way. Late afternoon light struck the plains in long slants, and the wind carried the sound of cattle lowing somewhere in the distance. When they came upon the house, Marshall slowed first. It was small, backed by a rise of earth for shelter, with smoke curling from the flue and a mule tied in the shade. He dismounted, motioning for Hollis to stay back. He approached the door with his hand near his coat. He knocked once, hard. A tall man answered, bearded and broad-shouldered, with a wary eye and a calloused hand resting on his belt. "You Pritchard?" Marshall asked. "Depends who's asking." "The boy. Where is he?" Pritchard looked past Marshall and spotted Hollis at the edge of the rise. His posture stiffened. "He's inside. Said someone might come. Didn't say it'd be his mama." Marshall didn't move. "Was he hurt?" "No," Pritchard said, and for the first time his tone softened. "I thought he was an orphan, paid for him fair, but he never smiled. Just watched the birds and sat quiet. I figured something wasn't right." "You'll let her see him," Marshall said. Pritchard stepped aside. Hollis had already dismounted. She walked past Marshall, up the few steps, through the door without a word. Inside, Daniel sat on a low stool by the hearth, a wooden bird in his lap. He looked up when the light shifted, and for a second he didn't move. Then he dropped the carving and ran. She caught him mid-step, both arms around him, her face buried in his neck. He clung to her, silent but shaking. Marshall stood outside, head bowed slightly. He didn't need to see more. Pritchard stepped out behind him, arms crossed. "Didn't mean no harm." "If I'd known, she doesn't blame you," Marshall said. "But I'd keep clear." Pritchard nodded once. "He's a good boy." They stayed in the house that night at Pritchard's quiet invitation. Hollis didn't leave Daniel's side. She fed him, washed his hands clean, and curled up with him under a patched quilt by the stove. He fell asleep with his fingers twined in her hair. Later, when the fire burned low and silence settled again, Hollis stepped outside. She found Marshall near the fence line, watching the stars come out. "He didn't forget me," she said. "No," Marshall said. "He never would have." She stood beside him, arms folded loosely. "You stayed with me, even when I didn't ask you to." "Didn't need asking." She was quiet, then turned to look at him. "You've been alone a long time, haven't you?" He didn't flinch. "I've gotten used to it." "I don't think I want to," she said. The wind shifted, warmer now. She reached out and took his hand. Not sudden, not uncertain, just sure. He looked down at their joined hands, then back up at her. "Then don't," he said. They left the Pritchard place just after dawn, Daniel curled in front of Hollis on Hawk's saddle, his small arms looped around her waist. The boy didn't speak much, but he clung to her shirt when the wind picked up, and his eyes followed every bird that passed overhead. Marshall rode beside them on a borrowed gelding, a flea-bitten gray with a steady gait and a dull eye, trailing a pack mule loaded with dried meat, oats, and a bedroll for the boy. They took a slower route back, following the river's edge where the grass grew thick and the ground stayed soft. There was no rush now, only the beginning of something that didn't yet have a name, but lived in the quiet glances between them, and in the way their movements had begun to mirror each other's. Near the edge of the Cashle Powder, they stopped beside an abandoned line shack, its roof bowed with years and moss thick along the eaves. Hollis laid out a blanket by the water while Daniel gathered pebbles and sorted them by color. Marshall walked the perimeter once, checking for signs of recent use, then joined her on the grass. He's strong, Marshall said, watching the boy crouch over his collection. Doesn't flinch easily. He hums when he's nervous, Hollis replied, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. He did it the whole first night after I found him. I didn't say anything, just let him. Marshall nodded. That's about the only kind of comfort that matters. I used to think I'd never be able to protect him right, she said. Now I wonder if it's enough just to stay close and not lie. He picked up a smooth stone and turned it in his hand. Sometimes that's the only promise worth making. She looked at him, eyes narrowed slightly. You ever wonder what it'd be like to stop moving? I've thought on it. And I figure if the right place had the right people, I might not feel the need to leave it. Her gaze held his for a long moment before Daniel's voice broke the quiet. Bird, Mama. Look. He held up a feather, bright blue and gray, longer than his hand. Holly stood and walked the few steps to him, crouching to admire it. Marshall stayed seated, watching them, how she brushed the hair gently from her son's forehead, how he leaned into her touch without hesitation. Later that night, the wind picked up again, and they took shelter in the shack. The roof held better than expected, and Hollis laid Daniel down on the bedroll near the hearth. She sat beside him, running her fingers through the boy's hair until his breathing deepened and steadied. Marshall added another log to the fire and leaned against the far wall, arms crossed loosely. He thought you were going to die, she said without looking up. Those first few days, he wouldn't let me sleep unless he could see my face. Marshall stepped forward and crouched down to her level. You're here now, he sees that. She looked up at him. I'll never forget what you did. I didn't do it for memory. Then why? He held her gaze. Because I saw you walk into that storm and not once turn back, because you didn't ask for pity, only a chance. Because I knew, even if we failed, I'd rather do it beside you than succeed with anyone else. She didn't say anything for a long time. Then she leaned forward and pressed her forehead against his. I don't know what comes next, she whispered. Marshall lifted his hand and cupped the side of her face with quiet care. We make a place, together, somewhere he can run free and never be afraid again. Her breath caught, but she didn't pull away. Daniel stirred beside them, and she turned to soothe him, pulling the blanket higher over his shoulder. Marshall stood and stoked the fire until it burned low and soft. When he lay down that night, it was near the hearth, a few feet from where Hollis and Daniel slept. The boy's breathing stayed even, no tremble or hum beneath it. Outside, the wind died down, and the sky stretched wide and starless above the plains. Morning brought warmth. They ate quietly, Hollis feeding Daniel spoonfuls of oats while Marshall saddled the horses. She moved with a calm he hadn't seen before, not the tight determination of someone fighting to hold on, but the ease of someone beginning to believe again. They rode south toward Greeley. By late afternoon, they passed the ridge where the cottonwoods grew and the dirt road turned wide beneath their horses' hooves. A small homestead sat just off the trail, a whitewashed cabin with a slanted roof and a vegetable patch already greening. Marshall pulled up short. That one's been empty since last year. Couple moved east after the husband lost his leg in a thresher accident. Belongs to no one now. Hollis looked over the land, then down at Daniel, who leaned against her back, half dozing. What would it take to claim it? Paperwork. A meeting with the county clerk, a few dollars. She turned toward him. Could you help me with that? I will, he said. I'll help you build it too. There was no more to say. She reached out and took his hand again, and he held it with the same steadiness he had offered her from the first. They turned toward the cabin together. Daniel opened his eyes and looked out over the land, then up at his mother. Is this home? She smiled. Yes, baby. It is now. The land folded gently around the cabin, its fences leaning but still holding, soil dark and rich near a spring-fed trench that caught the melt from the high country. By the second afternoon, Marshall had patched the roof with salvaged planks from the barn, and Hollis had cleared the hearth of soot and ash. Daniel wandered the yard with a stick in hand, drawing invisible boundaries in the dirt, occasionally pausing to watch the wind stir the prairie grass. Inside, the boards creaked under Hollis's steps as she swept dust from the corners and aired out linens left behind. She found a child's carved stool tucked beneath the bed frame and placed it near the window without comment. Marshall brought water in from the pump and set to mending the door that hung crooked on its hinges. "You ever build a chicken coop?" Hollis asked, peeling potato skins at the table. "Once," Marshall said, tightening a hinge with a rusted nail. "Didn't hold up long. Coyote got in. Well, if we're going to keep eggs, I'd rather not feed them to the wild. I'll dig the post holes tomorrow. Fence'll need to be sunk deep. This ground shifts when the rains come." She nodded, brushing the peelings into a bowl. "I'll trade preserves with that woman near the river." She had hens. Marshall looked over his shoulder. "You thinking of staying?" Her hands stilled in the basin. "I already did." Daniel came in with a dried thistle crown balanced on his head. "It's for the scarecrow," he said, setting it carefully on the table. "You planning to build one?" Marshall asked. The boy nodded solemnly. "He has to watch the garden." Hollis nudged the crown toward the edge. "We'll need an old coat and some straw, maybe that feed sack behind the barn." Daniel's eyes lit up. "Can I paint the face?" "You can draw it in charcoal," she said. "We'll hang it high, keep the jays off the beans." After supper, they sat on the porch. The sun fell slow behind the distant hills, and the sky warmed to a quiet amber. Marshall leaned back on his heels, cleaning his pocketknife with a strip of cloth. Hollis rested her elbows on her knees, fingers laced. "You miss the badge?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. "There are days when I miss the clarity, knowing what needed doing. But not the weight." She studied his profile. "You carry it either way." He ran the cloth once more along the blade, then folded the knife shut. "Some things stay with a man, doesn't mean he has to walk alone." "I never meant to build a life with anyone again," she said. "After Daniel's father died, I didn't think. I didn't feel much at all for a long time." Marshall's voice was low. "What changed?" "I got on a wagon with a liar," she said, "and met the man who walked beside me through a thunderstorm." He didn't look at her, but the corners of his mouth twitched. "You planning to keep him around?" "I'm thinking I might." Daniel had fallen asleep on the porch step, his head resting against a sack of oats. Hollis lifted him gently, carrying him inside. When she returned, the sky had deepened to violet and the fireflies had begun to flicker along the tall grass. Marshall stood, brushing dust from his trousers. "I'll sleep in the barn tonight. Walls are solid, gives you space." She stepped closer, her voice quiet but steady. "You don't have to." He looked down at her, and for a moment neither moved. Then he took her hand, rough palm against her calloused fingers, and pressed it to his chest. "I'll stay," he said. They walked inside together, the door closing behind them with a soft click. The wind outside shifted course, rustling the cottonwoods in the wash and somewhere in the dark fields beyond. An owl called once and fell silent. In the days that followed, they planted rows of beans and corn, patched the barn roof, and strung wire between cedar posts. Daniel named the scarecrow Mr. Windy and checked on him each morning. Hollis traded jam for hens, and Marshall traded labor for seed. Evenings came with supper by lamplight and the sound of frogs calling from the creek. One morning, Hollis pulled on her boots and found Marshall already outside, shirt sleeves rolled, hands stained with fence tar. She crossed the yard, wiping her hands on her apron. "I've been thinking," she said. "If we're going to make this place ours, we best start calling it something." He glanced up from his work. "You have a name in mind." She looked toward the horizon. "Hawk's Rest," his brow lifted. "For the horse," she said. "And for what we never had before." He reached for her hand, then kissed her brow with the quiet reverence of a man who finally knew where he belonged. "Hawk's Rest," he said. "It's home." The days grew longer. By early June, the cottonwoods along the creek had filled out so thick with leaves that their shadows reached clear to the porch by noon. Bees hung low near the rows of squash blossoms, and the hens wandered further from the coop, scratching under the elderberry bushes. Marshall came in from the west field with dust on his boots and a length of rope slung over his shoulder. Holly stood at the wash basin. Sleeves rolled as she rinsed out the baby quilt she'd finished hemming the night before. She'd begun sewing again, nothing fancy, just strong stitches in clean calico, and each piece she made found its place in the cabin without fuss. "You see the way Daniel's been lining up those stones along the fence," Marshall said, leaning the rope against the wall. "Made a full circle around the birch tree this morning. Looks like he's building something." "He's making a corral for his imaginary pony," Holly said, wringing the cloth. "Says it's black with a white blaze and answers to the name Dusty." Marshall grinned. "That's so," he asked if we could build a real one. "A corral, I mean, for when he's big enough to ride." Marshall picked up a towel and handed it to her. "We'll put it beside the lean-to. Let him help drive the posts." They stepped outside together. The air smelled of sweetgrass and fresh sawdust. Daniel sat near the garden, focused on a small wooden box he'd filled with feathers and bits of river glass. Every so often, he glanced up, as if checking that the world around him hadn't shifted. "Marsh," Holly said, her voice low, "you ever think about what it means, the way things settled like this?" He rested a hand on the porch rail. "I've thought about a lot of things lately. Like how I used to wonder if peace was something a man had to earn or just stumble into. And what do you think now? I think I was standing in my own way more than once. I didn't trust quiet, thought it was just the calm before something worse." Holly's turned to face him fully. "And now I think quiet might be the sound of something growing." A hawk circled high above the fields, its wings catching the light. Daniel pointed toward it with a stick, calling out something only the bird could understand. That evening they walked the fence line together, checking where the posts had shifted after the last rain. Holly's carried a lantern while Marshall drove stakes deeper into the soft earth. They moved without needing to speak, their rhythm practiced, easy. Afterward, they sat behind the cabin on a blanket, watching fireflies blink in the tall grass. Holly's leaned her head on his shoulder, and he traced idle circles along the back of her hand. "I keep expecting to wake up and find all this was just a stretch of luck," she said softly. "It's not luck," he said. "It's what we made, hard and slow and real." She turned to look at him. "You think you could marry again?" He met her eyes. "If the woman was you, yes." She didn't answer right away, but the stillness between them was thick with meaning. Then she reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small length of blue ribbon, frayed at the edges. "I found this in Daniel's satchel back when I was washing his things. He said it was from a May Day festival back in Missouri. Said he kept it 'cause it reminded him of me." Marshall took it carefully, fingers brushing hers. "It's soft. It's the only thing I have from before. Everything else was traded or left behind." He looked down at the ribbon, then back at her. "Let's use it to tie something new." The wedding was quiet. The preacher came from downriver, a kind man whose wife brought a pie and a pair of carved candle holders as a gift. Daniel wore a buttoned vest too big for him and carried a bunch of wildflowers he'd picked himself. They stood under the cottonwood tree, where the shadows fell long and cool, and said their vows with bare feet on the packed earth. Hollis wore a pale green dress she'd sewn herself, and the wind lifted her hair in soft waves as Marshall brushed his knuckles over her cheek and promised never to leave. Afterward, they shared bread and beans with the neighbors who came ranchers with sunburned necks, 2 schoolteachers from town, and the widow from across the creek who brought a jug of cider and cried during the ceremony. That night, after the guests had gone and Daniel was asleep beneath his quilt, Holly stepped out onto the porch and found Marshall watching the sky. She wrapped her arms around his waist from behind. "You're quiet." "So are you." "I'm happy," she said. He turned and pulled her close, resting his forehead against hers. "So am I." "I didn't think it was possible," she whispered. Marshall kissed her then, slow and sure, one hand at her waist, the other cradling her jaw like something precious. They stood there as the stars came out, holding onto each other not in desperation, but in peace. Years passed. The garden grew thick with tomatoes and beans. Daniel learned to ride a roan mare they'd traded for during a dry season, and Dusty, the imaginary pony, was retired to the pasture of memory. Holly started a small sewing circle that met under the tree on Sundays, and Marshall carved wood in the evenings, leaving smooth horses and birds along the windowsill for Daniel to paint. They raised chickens, 2 milk goats, and a second son named Elias, born just before the first frost one October. He had Holly's eyes and Marshall's quiet way. They never left Hawk's Rest. There was no need. Sometimes, in the still of early morning, Marshall would wake to the sound of Holly's breathing beside him, the soft creak of the wind against the shutters, and the distant murmur of the creek, and he'd know he'd found everything he'd never dared to hope for. They lived the rest of their days like that, rooted, content, and side by side.